Evening, guys. My name's Ben Marshall. I'm a member here at Mosaic. Unfortunately, Rob Rudd was actually going to be the guy teaching this week, but he had to step out last minute, so I'm going to step in. Max just grabbed the first white bald guy he could find to replace Rob. So, what are you going to do? This week's stories or collections of stories, is pretty random. We get the birth of Isaac, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away. Uh, you get this covenant between Abraham and Abimelech, and then you get the big one at the end where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And the thread that connects all this and would be our theme today is simply this: that God brings Abraham's faith to maturity. Okay, that God brings Abraham's faith to maturity. Um, and the way we're going to gauge this as we go through God bringing Abraham's faith to maturity is there's this question constantly before Abraham that is this: that will you trust me or not? Will you trust me or not when the covenant promises that I've previously made to you are at risk? Okay. Uh, so far, up till now, Abraham's results have been a mixed bag. Sometimes he's crushed it, and sometimes he has failed miserably. But as God brings Abraham's faith to maturity, in our stories we're going to go over this week, a couple of them mirror previous situations that we've already gone over where Abraham has failed to trust in God's promises, and yet this time Abraham's going to nail it. So the first story we're going to look at is the birth of Isaac. God follows through with his promise for a child at the exact same time he promised to Sarah, and the elderly new parents rejoice, right? It's a really, really sweet scene. It seems short and unceremonious to think we spent all this time looking forward to the promised son, and it's just a few verses that celebrate his birth. And I think a lot of that has to do with the big climax of the section is going to be when God asks Abraham to sacrifice him. But it is really joyful and it is really sweet. You get that moment where Sarah and Abraham are laughing in joy, which is a reversal from their previous doubtful laughter that they had when God told them he was going to give them a son. Uh, just in a small example of how I think this might have felt, I remember a number of years ago we had this unexpected cost come up that I was stressed out about, and not too long after I got this unexpected bonus from work, and the amount that I got was almost exactly the amount of this unexpected cost that had popped up. And I remember staring at the bank account when it had popped in that it would get covered, and I would just remember thinking like, huh, okay, okay, awesome, And it was like this mix of joy, of I felt kind of guilty for being so stressed out about it, like God wasn't going to take care of us, like a little bit of shame, a little bit of shock, a little bit of trust and worship. It's all that mixed in together. And I think that, certainly a smaller scale of what Abraham and Sarah were going through, but I think there might be a picture of kind of how they felt. Something quick too I want to point out. Just why would God choose to go about providing an heir to an elderly set of parents like this? Like, what's the point? And in the same way that we see Isaac being a foreshadow of Christ, Sarah is also a foreshadow of Mary, right? Because if God was going to give a long-awaited son to a woman well past childbearing age, there's no other explanation that could be given other than that it comes from God, right? There's no way it could have happened other than that God came through on his promises. In the same way that there's no way a woman who had yet to be married could have mothered Jesus, right? So it's really cool. A long-awaited son born to an impossible mother. The next one we look at, the next section, is Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, all right? There's a feast to celebrate the weaning of Isaac, but Ishmael begins to mock Isaac, and it sets Sarah off. She then demands that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. But God reassures Abraham that he will care for the mother and son, and Abraham sends them away with food and water. And then on the brink of death, out in the desert again, Hagar is visited by God, and he takes care of her and promises to bless her and her son. So I mentioned earlier that some of the scenes this week mirror previous scenes that Abraham has already gone through and failed, right? And this one is nearly identical to the one back in chapter 16. There, Abraham got the directive from Sarah to go sleep with Hagar. After he does, Hagar gets severely mistreated by Sarah, and Abraham basically absolves any responsibility, and Hagar is sent out into the desert where God rescues her again. It's almost identical, but the major difference in between the two stories is how Abraham responds to Sarah's demand. So back in chapter 16, Sarah told Abraham to sleep with Hagar, and he goes right for it without a word. Then when Hagar despises Sarah and Sarah blames Abraham for her trouble, Abraham literally says, do whatever you think is best, right? And she severely mistreats her. So in response to that question that's ever before Abraham from God, like, will you trust me or not? There he didn't, and neither did Sarah, obviously. He didn't trust that God would give him a biological offspring, but he takes the easy way out with his fiery wife and attempts to wash his hands of the situation afterward. But now compare this to our section in chapter 21. So I want to read this. This is chapter 21, starting in verse 10. And Sarah said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance of my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. So this time, Abraham does not immediately acquiesce to Sarah's unrighteous demand, right? He pauses and he struggles with how to respond, and it disturbs him greatly. And then when the Lord speaks direction into his life, Abraham trusts God and obeys him immediately the next morning, right? To bring this home for us, you can't help but see the parallels in the marital strife that Abraham and Sarah experienced to what I know we all experience. I would certainly never suggest that any of our wives have ever been in the wrong, but I would certainly suggest we've all experienced times where we have been in some pretty intense disagreements, where we've been dug in on our position, whether that's positive or negative. It may be, I think this is the direction we should go for our family versus I think we should go in the opposite direction. And that's really tough. That's really hard, even if it's in a good context, but especially if it's in a bad one. And if, one of you is bringing up past sins of the other, like Sarah did to Abraham, if one of you is in a position that's clearly unbiblical or wrong, I mean, that's really hard. And the easiest response for us to do is to do just like what Abraham did the first time around and just throw up our hands and take whatever route gets her out of our ear the fastest. I don't care. Do whatever you think. I got to go to work, right? Or like, if that's what you really think is best, go ahead and do it. I'm going to bed, right? Just to leave the situation and get out of it. Whatever gets you to the peaceful moment as quickly as possible is what we tend to do, right? But as we see in our theme that God has brought Abraham's faith to maturity in this area, where he's failed in the past and dealt with those painful consequences, this time he responds in faith and obedience, right? He pauses and thinks through, and when God speaks to him, he obeys, right? And I think we all know that that's a pretty big mark of maturity, because I can certainly say for myself, I've failed many times in that area, and I know you guys probably have too. I also want to hit on that one phrase very quickly where it said early in the morning. This has popped up a number of times in Abraham's story, and I'm sure you guys have talked about it. I know the guys at my table have talked about it as well. But man, if I think about all the times in my life where I have delayed obedience, if that's such a thing, just the amount of like peace and joy and vivacity and restoration that I robbed from myself by delaying that is just tragic. And so, unfortunately, sometimes it takes painful situations to learn that lesson. But through that, I can see how God has helped me to be so much faster now, because, faster in obeying, because I know his way is better versus mine of fighting it. So that's a little aside. So our next section, Abimelech and Abraham make a covenant. Now this one feels pretty random, for sure. Abraham meets with Abimelech, who comes along with his military commander, and he recognizes how much God's blessed Abraham, and he wants Abraham to deal kindly with him in the future. Then Abraham brings up this little conflict about the wells, and they settle the grievance and end up going their separate ways. So from this perspective of God bringing Abraham's faith to maturity, okay, this episode calls back to when Abraham was dealing with Pharaoh and when he was previously dealing with Abimelech. And he lied about Sarah being his sister versus really being his wife in order to protect himself, because he was afraid that they would kill him to take his wife. But here, in total contrast, Abraham responds decisively and confidently and honestly, even in the presence of the military commander, which I thought was interesting. Might have been, extremely intimidating for him to do that. And so that question that's before him again, I keep referring to, will you trust me or not? Will you trust me to be your safety? Will you trust me with your future, right? And Abraham does, where he hasn't before. That's awesome to see. Okay, so now we get to the big one, the binding of Isaac, or Abraham God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. This one's pretty uncomfortable for sure. This is actually a story that I used to skip a lot when my older daughter was younger. When we would read this in the Jesus Storybook Bible, it's kind of our nightly routine to read a Bible story. And I didn't want her to think I was going to kill her or God was going to ask me to kill her. And so I just skipped over this a few times. And then eventually my wife corrected me and said she needs to know the truth. So I don't hold back anymore, but nonetheless, it is uncomfortable. But God tests Abraham by commanding him to travel to a mountain there to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham obeys all the way up to a point of having the knife up over his son before God stops him. A ram is provided for the sacrifice in place of Isaac, and then Abraham is honored for passing the test, and God responds by reaffirming and expanding on the covenant promises that he's already given Abraham. So I want to hit that tension right off the bat. There are so many questions and discomfort with this. My dad actually told me, I was having dinner with him a few weeks ago, and he said he's remembered my grandpa had such a hard time with this section. So obviously I inherited that discomfort from him. So is it okay that God asked him to do this? Like, it seems wrong, certainly uncomfortable at the least. So what's going on? Maybe first question, did God intend for Abraham to do this? And no, it's definitely no. We can see clearly that God was testing Abraham, by the way the text starts out the section, right? Sometime later, God tested Abraham, right? We know that this is a test. We also know that God also did not intend for Abraham to kill Isaac because child sacrifice is expressly forbidden. I think that got pointed out in our study guide this week. And we also know because how the story ends, God stops him. Okay, so God did not want him to do this. He did not intend for Abraham to actually sacrifice Isaac. So then why? Like it feels wrong, and if it feels uncomfortable to us, I would submit to you guys that it's because it's supposed to feel uncomfortable. And this is what I mean by that. On more than one occasion in the Bible, God asks someone specific in a specific circumstance to do something outrageous like this. And the point God is communicating to them in this outrageous ask is that this is not something, something I am asked for will not be something I require from my children, but it will be something that I will do for my children, right? That this thing is not something I'll require from my children, but it's something that I intend to do for you, okay? He's communicating the outrageous lengths that he will go in order to rescue and redeem us. Brief disclaimer, somewhat serious but also kind of funny. This is only something God would ask to do once, so it is for a specific situation, circumstance. This is not something that any of us would be tested with again, just to be clear. Now, this idea of a substitute, before we circle back to Abraham's response and his growth of faith, I want to talk about this idea of the ram being a substitute for a minute. So the story of Genesis and the story of the Bible as a whole is God's glory in redeeming his creation through Jesus, right? God's glory in redeeming his creation through Jesus. And God repeatedly provides promises and enters into covenants with his people, setting up the framework for our redemption. But God doesn't lay out the full plan in full detail at first. It's this progressive revelation of how he's going to go about redeeming us. And the plan continues to unfold detail after detail throughout the story of Genesis and throughout the bigger story of the Bible in general. He promised to Abraham originally our 4 capital P promises that we look at the end of each week, right? And that's that God would create a people in a place with his presence and for his purpose, right? Those are 4 we keep looking at. And so at this point in Genesis, it's critical to note that we know God will redeem his creation and his family, but we don't know exactly how. And in this episode where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, God communicates in a huge way how his presence will be among his people. So ever since mankind has sinned against God in the garden, their sins separated us from God's presence. And so there has to be a way for that sin to be removed for our holy God and his people to be back together again. And so here Abraham shows that sin and its deserved punishment have to be accounted for, but that God will allow the punishment for that sin to be passed to something else or someone else. We find in the next few books of the Bible that God allows Israel's punishment to be passed to animals through this sacrificial system. And then ultimately in the New Testament, we see that the ultimate sacrifice for our sin is going to be Jesus in his torture and death on the cross. The study guide did a phenomenal job of hitting these awesome foreshadowing points of Christ's passion here. You see the only son, similar to Isaac, all these symbols. You see sacrificed on a mountain. You see Isaac carrying the wood on his back, a father willingly sacrificing his beloved and long-awaited son, an expectation of resurrection on Abraham's part. I mean, the parallels are just endless. And it's just awesome to see. Another one the study guide pointed out that I think is just awesome is that they mention that the very place that Isaac was bound is the very place where Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. And what happened at the temple? It's where sacrifices were constantly being made on the people's behalf so that God's presence could dwell with the people, right? That presence. It's just awesome. And we also see that God isn't done with this specific place yet. We see in Revelation that the very city of Jerusalem is the focal point where God establishes his eternal presence with us. So I want to read that verse in Revelation 21. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And listen to this. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them and be their God. I love that continuity all the way through, from Genesis all the way through Revelation. That's my favorite thing to look at in the Bible, to see the foreshadows and the symbols and the echoes of certain themes. It's just the constant threads that carry all the way through. It's just the well seems bottomless that you go to. It's just find more and more, and it's so reassuring to me to see that kind of stuff, because I just know that couldn't be fabricated through all different time periods and authors and types of literature. The consistency is perfect, and it's just awesome. It's my favorite thing to see. But what is funny is that we, growing up in the church or outside of a Jewish context, we know Jesus before we know all of this Old Testament, and we learn it in reverse, right? All these foreshadows looking forward to Jesus. It's like we hear Jesus is the long-awaited answer, and he's like, fantastic. What's the question? And it takes a long time for us to go back and do all that homework to learn what was it that was being foreshadowed, what was it that was being looked forward to. And it takes a lot of work. And clearly I'm preaching to the choir here, but keep after your Old Testament reading plans, keep after men's and women's Bible studies. I'm so glad that we've done Old Testament studies the last 2 semesters, because we've gotten to look in detail at some of the rich foreshadowing we see come to reality in Christ. So it's great. Now back to Abraham. So now, while we know from the outset that God is actually testing Abraham, and we know now that there is this huge picture of how God is going to show how his presence is going to be with his people, it's so critical to note that Abraham did not know any of this. Abraham's faithfulness under all this emotional weight without knowing that is so striking. He has this 3-day journey, walking out to the mountain, has plenty of time to stew on it and go backwards. It's the hardest of Abraham's commands, and he responds perfectly. Ishmael's not around anymore. He's gone. There's no plan B. Abraham's not getting any younger. There's no reward promised. God just says go. Certainly he has intense love for his son at this point. And so many times when the risk of his offspring has seemed so tangible, Abraham responds in fear and control. And then now at the ultimate, will you trust me or not, from God, he crushes it. He crushes it. It clearly displays our thread that God has brought Abraham's faith to maturity. Even the command to go to the mountain to which I shall show you is a symmetrical bookend to Abraham's maturity. It goes back to that initial call where God asked him to leave your country and your kindred and your father's house to go to the land that I will show you, right? It's just trust me and go. You don't know where you're going yet, but I'll show you. And he does. It's awesome. And then God responds to Abraham's remarkable obedience by reaffirming his covenant and expanding on his promises, and even swears by his own name that he'll deliver on the covenant promises, which the book of Hebrews will later explain is the strongest assurance that God could have possibly given Abraham. And so, in Abraham's ultimate display of faith, it invokes God's ultimate display of assurance for him. What an awesome experience that must have been for him. Now, looking back on the binding of Isaac episode, we might be tempted to think, well, it's Abraham. Like, I mean, how could I show faith like that? How could God ever bring me to a point like this? And yet, Abraham's road to this level of faithfulness was anything but perfect. And as we've well known, his faith was very bumpy. And yet, all along, God was faithful to stay alongside him, to grow him, to test him, to encourage him, to reassure him. And I want us to see something very important through that through God's covenantal relationship with Abraham, God is showing us the framework by which he will save and transform his people. God did not select Abraham for a job and say, good luck. Back in chapter 12, he did not say, go to the land that I will show you and obtain for yourself that land, father many nations, earn my presence, and be a blessing to every family in the entire world, right? He doesn't say that. He says that he will stay with him, that he will work those promises through Abraham, and God will remain faithful to the covenantal promises. And that pattern that he has with Abraham is precisely the way that God rescues us in Jesus, sanctifies us by the Holy Spirit, and equips us to participate in his mission. He doesn't save us and then leave us to our own devices to follow his rules. And it's just incredibly encouraging because we know our lives look so much like Abraham's. A big mixed bag is what it is. And yet we know that God is patient and effective to work in us. Consider the famous verses in Ephesians as it relates to Abraham's life. Kind of keep his in mind as I read this. Ephesians 2:8 through 10. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we should walk in them. It's identical to Abraham, isn't it? It's identical. In the same vein of thought, Paul says in his letter to the Philippians, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident in this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. God was faithful to bring Abraham's faith to maturity, and he will remain faithful to us as well. So as we wrap up this week's, there's two points of application that I've been stewing on a lot that I'd love to share with you guys. What would any good lesson be without two clear points of application? So the first is, I think we ought to reflect and rejoice in God's work in our lives. Reflect on and rejoice in God's work in our lives. Like most of my good observations are not my own. A pastor once told me, it's always stuck with me, that I feel like in our Christian circles, we often get very good and very practiced at confessing our sins and where we're struggling and our doubts, but we get very poor at confessing the power of God in our life, the power of God working in our life, where he's grown us and what he's doing. And I think some of that is because there's some awkwardness surrounding some real legit humility where it feels weird to say, man, I'm crushing it. I've come so far. My leadership of my home is great. That feels weird, even if it's true. But when we don't when we're not in a good practice of reflecting in our life and rejoicing in it with each other and with ourselves, we forfeit a great deal of joy and power when we fail to do that. And it's so critical to recognize and rejoice in it because it's part of our testimony to ourselves and to the outside world to say, though I'm not yet what I soon will be, I'm not what I once was. And you can't argue with that changed life. It's awesome. So don't forfeit that. I would also implore you to encourage one another in how you see their growth. And that's weird too. And honestly, guys aren't the best at that. But sometimes we just can't seem to notice that unless someone tells us. And often too, it's sometimes where, someone will say, and you walk in such a spirit of humility, or you are so generous, or man, I see how kind and encouraging you are, or man, I see your generosity. And you kind of just think like, oh, that person's just like really nice. Like that's something a pastor would say. Like that's just a nice thing to say. They're coming up with something. If they knew me, they would not say that. Or if they knew what a struggle it was for me to be generous internally, even though I might seem that way to them, there is no way that really applies to me. If they really knew what was going on in my heart or my head about it. And I would really encourage you to not let those encouragements go in one ear and out the other, and to reflect on that, because it just may be something that God's been doing in you that you don't recognize yet. Just because it's a struggle doesn't mean it actually, I feel like it means the opposite. If you are struggling with it, it means God is growing you. Precisely means God's growing you in that area. So encourage one another and listen to it when each other does. And if you're trying to reflect on your life as well, and you just can't see the growth of faith in your life, I would encourage you to share those feelings with your table or with somebody you trust, because I think there's a good chance there's one of two things going on. And the first one, I think, is the enemy's presenting a lie to you that you're unchanged, and it aims to rob you of a lot of joy and peace and power in your life with God. Aims to rob you of a lot of vivacity that belongs to you in Jesus. And trusted friends can really speak into the ways that they see God's work in your life, kind of what I've been talking about. Or perhaps another thought might be, if you just can't see any change or growth in your life, maybe God is presenting a sweet invitation to you to step into a relationship with Him or a faith that you haven't yet. So don't pass up on those feelings. And lastly, will you trust me or not? This repeated question for Abraham is the same question that's constantly before us. Will you trust me or not? This certainly applies in the big moments. Will you go plant a church? Are you called to the mission field? Will you, give financially in a big way that I feel like that I'm being called to enter into adoption or foster care, or take a public stand for the gospel in some kind of tense situation at work that's going to be costly? Clearly, the will you trust me applies to big moments like this. But the more I thought about it, I think that question really almost categorizes everything we do in in our life as Christians. It frames so much of our choices and our decisions. Are you tempted to hoard money and to work feverishly to build up an ever-increasing bank account where you say you hit this limit, and of course you do and blow through it, and it's never enough? Are you doing that to secure your peace? I certainly am tempted to do that. But yet God promises, I'm your peace and I'll provide for you. So will you trust me or not, right? Do you fight feelings of constant fear or bad things happening to you and your family? God promises, I'm your shield and your refuge. So will you trust me or not? Is there something difficult perhaps going on in your life that you just can't make sense of? God promises, I love you. I know this seems crazy, but my plan is what's best for you. I have not forgotten you. So will you trust me or not? If there's anything we've seen from Abraham's life, it's that God is not only faithful, but He's worthy of our trust. And we never know what beautiful part of God's redemptive work He might unfold through our faithful obedience. Thanks, guys.